Welcome to C.S. Lewis Foundation webinar. It's good to see you all here. Thanks for joining us this evening. We recognize a lot of your names, and some of you seem new, so welcome. Those of you who've been here before, those of you who haven't. My name is Christopher Howell. I am the academic director at the C.S. Lewis Foundation, and we're excited to have you here. We're going to talk with D.S. Martin on the theme of a poet under the influence of C.S. Lewis. And so, as you know, if you've been here before, we often start with a sort of artistic angle in the beginning. Sometimes we'll have Ampersand and our ministry director play a song. But this time, since we're talking to a poet, we thought actually we would share a little bit of his poetry as a sort of meditation to start off with. So we will shortly share a poem and I'll read it, and then I'll introduce our speaker, D.S. Martin, and we'll hear from him. We will go ahead and begin. The poem, I'll share this, we should share the screen here, is Two Types of Ibex by D.S. Martin. This poem was the winner of the 2022 Fair Forward poetry competition and is from his forthcoming collection, The Role of the Moon. There are those who believe in resurrection and those who don't. People, that is, I'm talking about people, and those rodeo cowgirls in cliche clothes, untangling lassos of their own, they lift their eyes toward mountains. Where might their help come from? It's unthinkable to think of the Athabasca Glacier dripping down to nothing, though all it needs for rebirth is a new ice age. Hard to imagine the Egyptians, Incas, and Inuit inventing the same proofless premise. It's like the instinct newborn ibex get of how to bound along sheer slopes, and how they know the pretty red fox is not their friend. There are two types of ibex, those who thirst for the water 1,000 feet down, and those already drinking. So that was a poem by our speaker tonight, D.S. Martin. And so D.S. Martin is a Canadian whose poems have been published extensively in publications in Canada, the UK, Australia, Singapore, and Ireland. He is poet in residence at McMaster Divinity College and the series editor for Poiema Poetry Series from Cascade Books. He's written 5 collections of poetry, including Angelicus, Ampersand, and Conspiracy of Light, poems inspired by the legacy of C.S. Lewis. He has also compiled several poetry anthologies, including the Turning Aside, the Kingdom Poets Book of Contemporary Christian Poetry. And he is known as a champion for Christian poets, in particular through his long-running blog, Kingdom Poets, which we may talk about tonight. So thank you so much for joining us. We're very excited to have you, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say and then talking about it afterward.
Thank you for that introduction, Chris, and for the opportunity to share with this exciting community. My name is Don, and I'm a poet. I've been called to be a poet. I say that without meaning to be pretentious, in spite of it being rather presumptuous, even audacious, to think that other people should read the poetry I've written. This is who God has made me to be. As Madeleine L'Engle has said, the artist is truly the servant of the work. I am the servant of my poetry and the servant of the poetry of so many other poets. I am also consciously a servant of the kingdom. All of this and who I am may make me unique, but not extraordinary. God has called each one of us to take on various purposes. You might be called to be an academic, or a pastor, or a skilled tradesperson, or a visual artist. He has called us all to submit to the lordship of Christ, even though many people for now reject his lordship. And the rest of us have trouble every day with submitting to him. I have also been called to be a teacher and a husband, a father, and now a grandfather. The poetry I write often comes out of my spiritual insights into what I have read and into the world in which we find ourselves. My most recent book is called Angelicus. And you got a picture of it right there. Thank you. And it consists entirely of poems written from the point of view of angels. I will read some of those poems in a moment, In much the same way that C.S. Lewis found that George MacDonald had baptized his imagination, I found that reading Lewis gave me permission as a young Christian to give my baptized imagination free rein. This was the preliminary stage of my calling to be a poet within the often hesitant sphere of evangelical Christianity. Although the evangelical church in the 1960s and 70s was not an arts encouraging place, it was a place that valued words. In those days, we were expected to memorize significant chunks of scripture from the beautiful King James Version, words which continue to resonate in my mind and inspire me. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that has been made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. And the light shineth in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. Secondly, Baptist preachers, when I was a kid, unpacked Bible passages from the pulpit, paying particular attention to the significance of every single word in the text. Words were important. Thirdly, there are so many profound hymns of the faith which we sang over and over again until both their truths and their beauty resonated for me, even though I was a kid who loved rock radio and would not at first have seen these hymns as my music. This is the background, and maybe many of you recognize that background as the same as your own. But it was the way that God designed me that caused these things to be impactful. I'm an auditory learner. I love music. And I'm someone who is prone to thinking things through for myself. So when Jesus said in the Sermon on the Mount, consider the lilies, or consider the birds of the air, he was not only speaking to my reflective nature, but also telling me that I could understand significant truths through thoughtful observation. Now, almost every poet demonstrates that they believe the universe is meaningful and that we can learn things about it through observation. They demonstrate this through the way they talk about our world. Reading well, as those of you connected with the C.S. Lewis Foundation undoubtedly know, is a valuable spiritual practice. When compared with Jack Lewis, of course, I must confess that I have read very little. I have immersed myself in the Bible and in commentary about the Bible, and I've familiarized myself with a lot of contemporary poetry and poetry from the last 400 years or so. But I do not have a scholar's knowledge of any given period or school or movement. I'm a dedicated but sporadic reader, reading what inspires me for my own edification and purposes. My reading has been a practice of nurturing my interior life, and my interior life has been the reservoir from which my poetry has burst forth. In this, C.S. Lewis has been one of my primary influences. In my youth, I read and reread much of Lewis's writing. It had become something of an obsession of mine. And later I found when I took on the project of rereading his work again, I began to realize just how much of an influence he had been on my thinking. A scholar may read the work of an author in order to become an expert on that author, to teach his work and to write insightful criticism. This was not my interest. Once I had picked up Mere Christianity to reread it, more than a decade ago now, I rediscovered Lewis's extraordinary skill at writing analogies. How can anyone explain things we cannot touch or see? Jesus told parables, in part to help us understand, and in part to draw us beyond our understanding and into an interior life with him. C.S. Lewis helped us to perceive the unseen world through his insightful analogies. For example, in reflection on the Psalms, Lewis writes, of Jesus' teaching and of his handling of Old Testament scripture. He says, there is almost no letter in the words of Jesus. Taken by a literalist, he will always prove the most elusive of teachers. Systems cannot keep up with that darting illumination. No net less wide than a man's whole heart, nor less fine of mesh than love, will hold the sacred fish. What I did with this word picture is to grab hold and run with it. I didn't really even try to explain, but to expand the metaphor to let it do the work. The work that Lewis had intended. So here's my poem, which is called The Sacred Fish, and it's from Conspiracy of Light. You cannot desire to catch the sacred fish as much as he desires to be caught. And yet, he darts through the dim depths with tail swerve and swish, laughs with the joy of glistening fins at huge holes in your net through which he swims. To get the shining coin from his mouth is worth selling all you have. To get him, even better. Everything you know about him wavers in uneven light. Just below the surface, so it's barely wet, you let down your net as he dives to the bottom. You seek the depths as he leaps through the waves. You search the shallows as he heads for open water, and your nets come up empty. If you let him, he'll repair them himself. Trim knotted clumps and untied tangles, selecting the right fibers, he'll tear and twist the sinews of your heart into fine mesh. Stretch them as thin as a pin, as wide as your whole being, a needle shimmer piercing your soul. Better is one day in his boats than thousands elsewhere. What Lewis was doing with his analogy was to help us understand something of Christ's way of communication. My role as a poet is not to explain, but to weave words, to paint pictures in your imagination so that you are drawn to consider things. Our purposes are not the same. Lewis seeking to explain, and me prodding your imagination, but they do work together in harmony. This is why the brief image, which was sufficient for its purpose in reflection on the Psalms, was a doorstep I strode across into a new adventure. Obviously, when I embarked on the poetry project, which became my book, Conspiracy of Light, poems inspired by the legacy of C.S. Lewis, I chose to do more than simply expand his metaphors. I felt some responsibility for capturing something of who Jack was. In the first poem in that collection, I began by seeking to draw my reader into a familiar place, partly by allowing her to slowly discern the scene she's being invited into, and then by touching down on a significant aspect of his life quest. So this is called Of This and Other Worlds. A glance over your shoulder assures you you can always get back should this white wood overwhelm you. Fat, wet flakes descend slowly through the stillness. A flickering light beckons and you walk forward, snow pressed beneath your every step. All things are possible here. Times intertwine. You might find a lamppost in the forest. You might meet a faun, a goat man who invites you to tea and by his blazing fire tells of naiads and dryads dancing through the midnights of long ago. He may play his pipe and lull you into sleep's other realm. Much later, when you return to the familiar and even the flutter of pages has ceased, are you not seized with longing? When considering C.S. Lewis, we cannot overemphasize the importance of longing, or, forgive my mispronunciation, the German word Sehnsucht. This overwhelming desire partly arising for Lewis from the loss of his mother at a young age, it gives us a hint at what directed his journey. Lewis, of course, was a complicated, multifaceted character. A poet, a novelist, a medieval scholar, a Christian apologist, a theological popularizer, a literature professor. In his book, Preface to Paradise Lost, he recounts how a schoolmaster passed on his way of consoling his students concerning our need for footnotes in reading the works of the past, suggesting that if Milton came back from the dead, he would need far more footnotes than we do to help him read a modern novel. My overactive imagination grabbed hold of this one, and it resulted in the following poem. It's called Mr. Milton Tries to Read the Philosopher's Stone. I'll indicate with my hands which parts of the poem are the text that Milton is reading and which parts are the footnotes, and maybe that'll help as we go through. Mr. Milton tries to read the Philosopher's Stone. For those who find the reading of footnotes leaves them at the gates of Milton's paradise, lost and twice as alone, imagine Milton tossed into a 17th century annotated edition of Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of number 4, since the advent of a general postal system for delivering epistles, packages, and rejected poems, homes have posted a numerical street address on or beside the front door. Privet Drive. In an autonym, drive is a synonym for street, road, or avenue. This particular designation arose with the increase of automobiles, motorized vehicles with a combustion engine which spins their wheels, which people are said to drive. We're proud. Pride has gradually shifted in meaning through the centuries, becoming a positive self-image rather than one of the 7 deadly sins. 2. Here, Milton reaches the end of line 1 and decides to read something simpler, such as George Herbert or John Donne. I remember something Lewis had said about what it was like to write the Screwtape Letters, that permitting his mind to voice the thoughts of a demon, even with his intent of exposing demonic activity, that he just felt it was oppressive. Thinking about this influenced me when I formulated the idea for my most recent poetry book, which is called Angelicus, where I have 64 poems written from the point of view of angels. This approach enabled me to take the ordinary things of life and imagine how a heavenly being might see them. That is, to see the spiritual in them. This poem is called An Angel's View of Automobiles. Before they talk to their cars, they talk to their horses. Not just the giddy up and whoa, or the clucking tongue, but the patter of shared days, busy streets, unending rain. At least a cart horse could sense meaning from the tone of a familiar voice. A mare could mimic the melancholy of a burdensome journey in her plodding clip-clop, or mirror excitement in an equestrian canter. But now they speak to cold machinery, take directions from a disembodied voice. There's nothing of the animal-human bond. No consciousness like that of Balaam's ass to save his life from the angel's sword. Nothing about a car that can transport like Elijah's fiery chariot. Before they talked to their cars, some of them even talked with God. This next poem brings together 2 of Lewis's enduring qualities, his playfulness and his appreciation of the great writers of the past. This one is called An Angel's Asked About William Blake. You ask, was the young William Blake truthful? saying he saw a tree filled with angels, their wings glistening on every bough? Or was he sailing dangerously close to the shipwreck of a beating, weighing how far he dare frame such a fearful fallacy? You say, perhaps they were just birds, and young William was playing with words. Such an incident, if it ever occurred, would be less memorable to the heavenly host. Most would hardly notice a scruffy kid on a London street, even looking up into their tree. Was he a visionary, his eyes bugging wide in an apprenticeship of perceiving, having seen what others could not see? Or did he express his believing as though it were visible, stretching the faith he sought? You ask, was he mad, not knowing what was real? Or was he trying to test his perceptions? I say, good questions. Reading Lewis as a young man encouraged me to discover many great authors for myself: John Milton, Dorothy L. Sayers, Charles Williams, William Blake, G.K. Chesterton, George MacDonald, George Herbert, John Donne. In my forthcoming poetry collection, The Roll of the Moon, which will appear later this year, many of my poems are in conversation with the metaphysical poets, whom Lewis loved so well. The techniques I developed when writing Conspiracy of Light influenced the poetic voice in these new poems. I wrote a series of 19 poems in response to John Donne's 19 holy sonnets. This one came from inverting the title of Donne's Death Be Not Proud. It's called Pride Be Not Death. Pride, of course, is a difficult sin to combat because, as Lewis illustrates through Screwtape, it creeps in so subtly. In this poem, I am speaking to pride itself. So I'm talking to pride. Pride be not death. Metaphysicals 10. Pride be not death, for as I've stretched to reach out from these brambles, to cut away the vines about my ankles, to step out on this promontory, you swell in me like a boxer's battered nose, distorted and off color. You flutter like a fledgling finch demanding the attention of its mother, like a showroom convertible destined for the wrecking yard. But still I grasp for you, a rope to grab and release, hand over hand, a welcome provision, a helpful infatuation, a healthy garden, becoming greener and fuller and overgrown, entangling my feet and pulling me down.
Thank you so much for sharing your poems with us, for talking a little bit about your background and experience and what drew you to becoming a poet or to responding to the call of being a poet. Um, for those of you that want to ask questions, remember to use the Q&A button below. And we'll get started off here. I wanted to ask about one of the very first things you said about poetry and service. That was interesting to me. I think you mentioned not only being a servant of your own poetry when you mentioned it to us, but also servant of other poets' work. What do you mean by that? And is that comparable to in other art forms as well for those of us that aren't poets? Like how do we do this?
Well, for me, it works in a number of areas, and I suppose some of them are quite transferable to other, in other art forms. And I'm sure it would just take the imagination of a particular artist to apply it. But for me, I know, for example, I spend more time as a poetry editor than I do writing my own poetry.
Hmm.
It takes time to serve as a contributing editor for Ecstasis, to put together poems for Ephesians, to edit new books for the Poiema Poetry Series, and to encourage poets who are seeking to establish themselves. I have also recently been asked to be on the advisory board for the Canadian journal Traces. Beside these things, I'm committed to the work of Kingdom Poets.
Yeah, can you tell us? We have some questions coming in, but actually, can you tell us a little more about Kingdom Poets? Because in the chat, Nellie DeVries actually mentioned that she appreciates your exposure of so many other poets to the readers of your blog. So could you talk a little more about that for those of us that aren't familiar with it?
Sure. Kingdom Poets is something I started thinking I might do it for about a year or so, just something to that I thought was a good idea. Well, I started that in February of 2010, and I have done it every week, posted about a Christian poet every week since then, every Monday. Um, so what I'm doing there is in some ways I'm promoting the work of contemporary poets because I will often put up a post of when someone has a new book coming out. But in many ways, I'm also promoting the poets of the past. Some
Mhm.
of them are very well known. Some of them are people who are not well known. I post about poets from every conceivable denominational background, every part of the world, various time periods, right from the very early days of our faith, right to poets that are brand new and have just put out their first book. So in that, I'm serving their poetry as well as serving my own.
Hmm. And it does make me think about how, there's this image, I think, in everyone's mind, and this isn't just unique to poets, but maybe poets in particular have it of the sort of solitary artist, right? Really hashing something out, brooding over a stanza for who knows how long, you know. And this makes me think about just how communal and collaborative it really is when it's good poetry. It's never actually really like that. It kind of sounds like there's always an editor, a friend, a feedback, a community. I think like I was reading about The Wasteland and like how Eliot ended up writing it, and Ezra Pound just was savage in his edits.
That's very true. Yes.
And that that's what made it like he cut so much from it, but that's what made it such a good poem in the end.
Mm.
It's really interesting to hear from your perspective too as an editor as well.
Yeah, it's quite diverse in that way. Sometimes poets will be, as you say, very much on their own, but also I think we all benefit from having someone else read our work because when we write something, we kind of assume that everybody can see it the way we see it, which is not true. So to
Mhm.
step back from it and to have other people make comments, even to say, I don't really understand this line, or you know, I'm getting an impression here that I don't think is what you're trying to communicate. I think that's really important, and yeah, I think it's valuable for us to encourage each other and to help each other in those ways.
Mm. We've got some questions coming in now. I don't know the first name of this submitter. The last name is Hogren, first name initial S. So S. Hogren wants to know if you would to share what maybe you've discovered, delights, the sadnesses about yourself as a creative and your creator as you have traveled all these years as a poet. Kind of a big question, but I thought an interesting one.
So, Chris, so the person's saying how I find being a creative person through my journey. Is
Yeah,
that?
how has it helped you sort of discover yourself as a creative and also your relationship to God as a creator, I think in your uh throughout your careers. Or, I mean, because that's something, Tolkien always write about, but like sub-creation is this thing of sort of imitation of God, right? I kind of maybe see it going in that direction.
Well, those are two really quite divergent questions in a way. To
Hmm.
think about God as creator, I think those who are involved in creativity, and that should be all of us in one way or another, but particularly people in the arts, I think we can sense when we see God's creation, I think we appreciate it just that much more because we realize this didn't just happen. Because, the poems we write or the paintings we make or the novels we create, they didn't just happen. There's a lot involved in the process. Not to say that we are, I mean, yes, we're created in God's image, and in some ways we're like him, and in many ways we're not. But I think that creative people definitely appreciate all that God has done in maybe in a different way, a wider way than people who are less so. As far as my own journey, I th it's a process. I mean, it's you're writing something and you at first you may be saying, well, this isn't any good. And you come back to it, you write something you think is great, and you come back and you realize it's drivel, and it's a lot of work to get to that point. But then you begin to gain a little confidence that, okay, I think I know how this works now because I've been developing the craft.
Mhm.
And I think that helps to view creativity in a broader sense all the more because any of us who are involved in any aspect of the arts, we're not great at everything. We don't have skills that cross every line. So I think we're able to experiment more and learn from each other and see what other people are doing. I do like reading about what things that are going through the heads of painters or
Hmm.
movie makers and as they're working on their art to try to think through, okay, how did they come to terms? Because we're often wrestling with things when we're producing. It's not just some some image that comes from nowhere. It's things we're trying to wrestle with.
Can you say a little more about the development of the craft? Because that, I think, for those of us that are creatives, that is always the struggle, right? How do you get to the point where you can discern when you wrote something and you think later, oh, that's not good, or that is, and I can fix it. Like how was that process for you throughout your life?
It's a process still. I mean, there's still things that because you take chances. So you might write something new that's quite different from anything you've done before, and you don't really know if it's any good yet. You have to give it some time and play with it, especially a poem that jumps around a lot, like the one we opened with tonight.
Mm.
It's not very linear, so it's harder to know, am I communicating this or am I just leaving everybody behind on this one? Um, so I find that you begin to become confident in your craft. That is, you know how to use alliteration well. You know if you like the sound, how much you like the sound of playing with rhyme, or at what point it starts sounding sing-songy to you. So you want to eliminate that. I mean, that's individual, but I do wrestle back and forth. Sometimes I will write a poem that's completely rhyming, and then I'll go, I don't like it, and I deconstruct it
Mm.
because because it just sounded too sing-songy to me. So on the other hand, I do write some very formal poems. So
Yeah, do you find the switching from a formal structure and rhyme and meter to more free verse? Is that or some how do you determine when you do beforehand? Like I'm gonna do this way and see what happens. I'm gonna stick to the formula and maybe it doesn't work. Or do you feel like it sort of grows organically?
it's fairly organic. That is, I usually start with writing some lines and some ideas, and sometimes a line just strikes me as it works well, and it would work well in a formalist setting. Or hey, maybe I should try just adjusting that a little bit, making it in, iambic pentameter, and see if it's going to contribute to a sonnet or to some other traditional form like that.
Hmm. Well, we've got some questions coming in about Lewis in particular and
Okay.
poetry. So Sarah M. Taj asked just a basic question, which is probably one that maybe you've gotten a lot. What do you think of Lewis as a poet?
In some ways, I'm afraid of that question because I don't want to, because it's so diverse. I mean, in many ways, Lewis, what he really desired was to be a poet. That's who he wanted to be. And in fact,
Mhm.
I don't think he's best known as a poet at all. I mean, he's so successful in so many other ways. He wrote some great poetry, but in some cases, he was trying to win an argument or something in a poem, which doesn't really work in a poem. Like he was very skilled at that, obviously, but that worked well in his some of his some of his books or when he was at the Oxford Socratic Club, for winning debates. I mean, no one could touch Lewis. Also, he was he had this amazing gift of basically anything he read, somehow he kept it in his head. It's almost like he could almost memorize everything he ever read, which is a something we all envy, I'm sure. But in some ways, it was a little bit of a curse because for Lewis, when he wrote poetry, he had a lot of trouble trying to, well, to be a 20th century poet when he's got the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th century hanging on his head, like going through. And I guess in that way, he wasn't much of a 20th century poet. He was much more of an earlier time. So I think his poetry, he had trouble with that. There's some really good poetry in his work, but he had just so much going for him that I think he struggled with the poetry. Maybe it's a sense that he was so busy with so many things, with so many talents. How could he take the time to focus a lot of time on his poetry? Like that's does take a lot of time and a lot of focus. So I'm wondering if, and maybe he didn't even have a sense that he should make it 20th century. He may have felt it should be more in the 19th century style.
Yeah, I mean, if I recall, he didn't have a high opinion of the modernists, right?
That's an understatement.
Yeah. So, what's interesting about that is those maybe those problems that he had with some of his steeped in the past as he was did make him a very good poet critic for
Yes.
sure. And
Oh, absolutely.
his English literature in the 16th century is such a strange book because it's so funny in addition to being such a fine-grained history. They recently did a renewed edition of this that HarperCollins published, so it's like easily accessible now for the first time, I think, pretty much in the history of that book. And even just in the first 70 pages, he's like overturning all of this history and engaging in this real radical revision of the Renaissance, and then goes into all this poetry. And I just thinking, like, I can't believe he was doing this for 20 years while he was working on all the other stuff that we have read from him. So maybe you're right. Maybe that got in the way in some respects. I
Well, he
don't
would
know.
have all of that in his head.
Mhm.
I mean, that's to me, that's mind-boggling.
Yeah, yes, Sarah M. Touch says that she's listening to it on audiobook. I don't know how that experience is. That's got to be a hard book to listen to on audiobook. Um,
Mm.
we've got a couple more questions related to Lewis. Aaron Lee asked about the connection of Sehnsucht and joy, which is, of course, a pretty common one, I think, in thinking about Lewis's biography. Do you? And so he links these two as seeing as a similar concept, the longing, the Sehnsucht, the joy that
Yes.
he felt the stabs of pain, I think that he described it as. And I mean, do you see, well, I guess I kind of want to maybe evolve this question a little bit. Do you see that in his poetry too? And do you see any of it in your poetry?
Mm. I have to admit, I think I nothing comes to mind right away, like specifically. I guess I've more looked at that in the sense of what moved him forward in his thinking, as opposed to sometimes what the specific things were he was talking about at the time, or thinking about, or wrestling with. I think that longing was the thing that kind of pushed him.
Do you see any of that in your poetry?
Well, I know I wrestle a lot with um, well, very similar to the metaphysical poets, John Donne and George Herbert, with trying to wrestle through concepts uh, of scripture, or trying to understand God, which is an absurd thing to say, because how do you understand God with our little puny minds? But I do. That's what I wrestle with. That's my longing, is to try to know God better, and not just intellectually, but know in my heart God better, in relationship, know him better. And that's, I think, where my longing
Hmm.
comes for sure. And that's very much behind a lot of what I'm writing.
Hmm. Julianne Post asks an interesting question about relating to poetry in the Bible. And especially in reflection of the Psalms, it does seem like Lewis often took a sort of figurative or allegorical interpretation of parts of the Bible. And maybe that shouldn't be surprising since he was steeped in a lot of medieval thinking, right? And
Okay.
they tended to do that. And so she asks about do you see the first few chapters of Genesis as poetry? And I would even ask further, like, I mean, how does it relate to the poetry in the Psalms of a different type or kind? And how does, how do you see this interplay, especially in the Old Testament?
Well, what I find most interesting about all the poetry in the Bible. I mean, obviously we have the Psalms, and yes, if you go back and you read Genesis, there is so much poetry in the way it is laid out. Um, even well, just this week I was leading a small group study on in the book of Ephesians, and we were looking at things, and I was pointing out the structural patterns within, like the way Paul had structured it in a literary fashion, and that drew me into looking at what he was doing more closely. But I find that I guess one of the biggest things about all the poetry in the Bible is it says to me something about God, in that if he wanted us to have a systematic theology, that's what he would have written for us. But he gave us a book of poetry, of stories, things for us to interact with and to think about and to wrestle with. And it's very relational. All of scripture is so relational. So to me, that says so much to me about who God is and what he was desiring and how we are to approach his word. I really believe that people who understand how to read poetry have a greater ability, or maybe not greater, but have a unique ability to read scripture. I think we can understand aspects of the Bible better because we understand how poetry works. And so
Mhm.
much of the Bible is poetry.
Yeah, in very distinct form, right? Like I think this Robert Alter is like a great scholar on the poetry of the Hebrew Bible and his kind of new translations that he tried to do of all of it, and really trying to hammer home the specific type of poetry with the use of parataxis and so on that is like really common in the Bible that isn't easy to capture in English. This is so he actually thought the King James, he argued, was probably the best one. Even so, we tend to look at it as kind of it's a 400-year-old translation. It must be out of date, but he still thought it was probably the best one. And so we could all maybe do kind of like what you did as a kid when you were steeped in it. I mean, how much do you see that? I noticed you had some King James in your poems that you read. It's just always there, it seems like.
It is there. It comes in, and I'm sometimes even just playing with the sound of a phrase from the Bible and saying something totally different. But part of my desire is to capture the music, but also that somebody would go, "Hey, that reminds me of," and to be drawn into thinking about that other thing.
Yeah, the
So,
one day in the boats and it
yes,
was
exactly, exactly. Yeah,
yeah,
one.
yeah. Uh,
Um,
well, so
so
what's interesting with that is you've talked a lot about your inspiration and connection to Lewis and the metaphysical poets and John Donne and I don't remember if you mentioned Gerard Manley Hopkins, but he's one that comes up a lot too. But I'm
that's
curious about because you cited Blake as well. What about the poets that are maybe quasi-Christian, not quite Christian, not Christian at all? How do you learn from them and read them and interact with them? Who are your favorites? Who are ones that you steer clear of?
wow. Well, first of all, it is kind of a tricky thing to draw lines about who are Christians and who aren't anyway.
Right.
And in Kingdom Poets, I admit I'm trying primarily well, the way I talk about it is I choose poets who take Christian faith seriously.
Hmm.
Even though I don't have a lot of people who I would consider who aren't Christians, but because often the heritage we've received of faith, in the same way that it goes into my poetry, the King James goes into my poetry, even though I'm a strong believer, it's not necessarily my faith that's always the thing that's coming through from the King James. There's different aspects there. So, I think of somebody like Dylan Thomas, who um, has had some people considered him to be a Christian, and many people would say, well, hold on, let's look at his life. But he certainly would be somebody who would take Christian faith seriously. I mean, poems like "And death shall have no dominion." I mean, you can't read that without going, okay, this guy knows something about the Bible, right?
And it does, maybe with the conversation about joy and longing, it does often seem like there's a slanted sort of insight that comes into it too, stuff that is really wrestled with by, say, someone like Thomas or William Blake, who maybe are sort of their position where their relation to the faith is unclear, but that in some ways gives them a really interesting perspective that we can learn from. Um, I feel that way of like reading certain poets that I like George Safaris, I mentioned before, is
Mhm.
kind of in that same category where it's almost seemed like he was like the had the physicality of a Christian of like wanting to be in church and like take communion and stuff, but not really sure if he believed in it. Which with in his position made him take it very seriously, and even wanting to kind of be a monk, but not being able to intellectually commit to that, gave him an insight that was really fascinating. Um, yeah, sorry.
Well, that reminds me of something I said earlier, and that is that all poets, or pretty well all poets, look at the universe, look at the world as something that we can understand better by looking at it. It's not all meaningless. There's some meaning, and if we look closely, we can gain some meaning and some understanding. So these poets that are doing that, in some ways, it's there's a validity to that they're, shall we say, on the edge of faith. They're looking at it and wondering, is this where the truth is lying? There are so many poets out there who actually were well-known poets and successful careers, and then they actually came to faith
Mhm.
through the writing of poetry. I think that that says something about the whole nature of the pursuit of truth that poets are involved in.
Mhm.
And I would say all artists are, but because poets are working with words, that's our medium, it's a little bit harder to just leave it out in the abstract.
Mhm.
So
I think
you
that's really,
so you
yeah.
have people like Margaret Avison or Denise Levertov, or even people like W. H. Auden, people who came to faith after they were already successful as poets.
Yeah, and in the way that that affects, because it can't not affect even the work they did before. Like
Hmm.
with Eliot, how would people feel about proof rock later? Now that we know that he's the guy that wrote four quartets 30 years later. How does that change how we view, his first poem? And even if it's the exact same words, it does take on a totally different resonance, and it kind of makes you wonder about what we do or don't know about these other poets and their work and so on. That is really interesting.
Right. Or you think about the wasteland. I mean,
Mhm.
suddenly it has a different connotation to it when you put it in the context of faith, even though he wasn't there yet.
Mhm. Arvin John Assis, sorry if I mispronounced it, says, amazing presentation and thank you for sharing. Um, as a poet and a creative, what advice would you give to other creators in order to be aligned with what Christ has intended us to be and to communicate well with today's generation? So, two questions there: alignment with Christ, but also communicating to today.
Well, I think first of all that we need to realize that we're not anything special as individuals. I mean, yes, we are special in that God loves us and he's created who we are and he's created who we are to be. But it's not like we have all the answers. We're there to take this what he's called us to do and to do it well, and to be of service. I'm thinking of we need humility and we need servanthood. Those things are so important. And I think if we're not trying to send a message so much as trying to wrestle with truth. We're trying to understand things. Not even so much that we're trying to convince an audience of something, but we're trying to find out what is it that God is saying to me here, and how am I interacting with God here? And it's kind of out in a public place. I don't think there's any big difference between reaching out to an older audience or a younger audience, try to reach the new generation, like, unless you're thinking about using techniques perhaps that are um, more cutting edge, if there is such a thing. I mean, that's a lot of room for opinion on that. But I think to just be humble and to be reaching out, and I think it's really important too to be involved in community. That is to reach out to other people in your art form and to be encouraged by them and to encourage them to and to be encouraging of people who are very already successful and of those who are not. Like to
Mm.
be just giving of yourself to other people in that way. I don't know if that really answers the question, but
Yeah, I mean, I think that's very helpful, and I mean, it maybe connects a little bit to some of your judgment of Lewis's poetry that maybe sometimes it did get a little bit too much into trying to make coming at it with a with an argument to make, as opposed to I think what you were describing maybe a little bit more organic. I think you can kind of tell in his work when he is and isn't doing that, right?
that's true. I think the poetry is a little different than some of the other art forms he was involved in this way, because poetry isn't about winning arguments. It's about giving people things to think about.
Hmm.
And he had so many good answers already, so it's really hard to hold those back, I suppose.
Yeah, and I wonder, do you think maybe that's it's a little difficult for those of us like that grew up in traditions that really prioritize things like apologetics and witnessing and things that's what a lot of maybe stories and writing are for, to do that kind of thing. Is that something that you have to shelve when you're thinking about poetry? Or how do you see that?
I think so, but
Mhm.
that doesn't mean those things aren't important. Like those,
Yeah.
they just have a different place.
Hmm. We will have time for another question or two, maybe after the announcements, but we'll have President Stephen Elmore come on to give a couple announcements about upcoming events. Like he'll getting his screen on here. I don't know. There might be.
Yeah, I'm having some
You're
issues
getting
starting my
okay. You
video
got
for
it.
some reason.
Yeah.
So let me try to get the video actually started. Hold on. Having some trouble. I have another app that I think's on. There we go. Hi, Chris, and thank you so much, Don, for being with us tonight. It's been illuminating. I have a few announcements to make about upcoming events and other things at the foundation. For those of you who are long-term friends, I saw a lot of you in the chat. Welcome again. And for those of you that are new, we love to see new people in our community, and we really value faith, reason, and imagination in the company of friends at the C.S. Lewis Foundation. And welcome to the group. So first, I'd like to thank all of our partners and volunteers for making this webinar possible. It's really because of your generosity that gives us the ability to shine a spotlight on speakers who are living what we call the legacy of C.S. Lewis in higher education, ministry, and the arts. Our goal at the foundation is to equip, educate, and encourage Christians to live out their faith in the world of ideas and the arts, becoming more effective in influencing the culture around them for Christ and his kingdom. If you'd like to support these webinars or the work of the foundation, please consider joining us by making a gift today through our website, cslewis.org. We're particularly raising funding right now to repair the roof at C.S. Lewis's home, the Kilns, which we own and operate in Oxford, England. It's either going to be about 19,000 pounds or 38,000 pounds, so that's quite a bit. So we welcome any help we can get in doing so. We'd be very grateful for your generosity. Uh, in other news, we have a big event coming this year, and we'd love to see you there. Uh, on July 24th, we're going to be starting our C.S. Lewis Summer Institute in the beautiful city, Lewis's birthplace city of Belfast, Northern Ireland. It will be a week-long conference in the city and county where Lewis was born and raised, and it's where he returned regularly for most of his life. Many of his summers off after he taught term throughout the year, he would go back to Northern Ireland. The theme of the conference is Returning Home, C.S. Lewis, Roots and Transformation. The theme is about equipping us as Christians by looking at the Christian journey as a whole. Our stories that we tell ourselves and our metaphors matter, as you heard tonight. So we're looking at the metaphor of the journey, the hero's quest, pilgrimage, and other ideas in learning about what it means to be a Christian, what it means to interact with the world, what it means to struggle in life, form community, and engage the world for Christ. Each morning of the conference, we'll have two speakers, worship and what we call whimsies, which is a short artistic interlude. And every evening has artistic performances, some of them participatory. We're going to have a ceilidh, which is a almost like a square dance, country dance in Northern Ireland. We're also going to have a hymn sing, and then the rest of the evenings are more sit back and watch the show. Right now, I could just announce that we've just added Odd Damn Dance Company to our lineup. They're our dance company that often, a Christian dance company that often joins us in our Camp Allen retreats in Houston, Texas. They're touring Europe, and they're going to come join us for one of the evenings. And they also have with them Joanne Hogg, who was the lead singer of Iona, the progressive rock band from Northern Ireland that was very popular in Europe and in some parts of the US and other countries. So we're excited to have her. That's just hot off the press. It just happened last week. So I think we just announced it in our email. We also are working on some of the other arts performances, and we have The Major and the Missionary from Diana Glyer, based on her book about Warren Lewis, C.S. Lewis's brother. After C.S. Lewis died, Warren had a long correspondence with a missionary in Papua New Guinea, and it's a wonderful story. So that'll be one of the other evenings. In any case, our speakers and artists so far include Malcolm Guite, Alistair McGrath, John Lennox, Diana Glyer, Kurt Thompson, Andrew and Kristen Lazo, Kirsten Jeffrey Johnson, among several others. We also added, just in the last month and a half, Amy Orr Ewing, and we're working on one more edition, but I'm still working with him, so I can't announce his name now. We'll be hosting the conference at the Belfast Assembly Buildings, Presbyterian Assembly Buildings, City Hall, Queen's University, the Titanic Museum, C.S. Lewis's grandfather's church, St. Mark's Tondela, and also the Belfast Cathedral. If you have any questions about that conference, please visit our website, cslewis.org/programs/SI for Summer Institute, and Joshua will probably put that in the chat. But also, we're going to have an info session, the next one on Sunday, March 16th. We do have it up for registration already. If you go to cslewis.simpletix.com, you can register for that. It'll be in the Sunday afternoon Pacific time, so it gets in the Sunday evening elsewhere. And we'll also announce it in our email newsletter if you're subscribed. We're also continuing to accept applications for scholarships for the conference, which are open to all. You don't have to, it doesn't hurt, but you don't have to be a student, faculty member, or Christian artist to receive that, or ministry worker. Anybody is available. I mean, we're open to anybody applying for that. And back to you, Chris and Don.
All right, thank you very much, Steve. We're right about at time here, so we'll in a second I'll give you a space for a closing word. I did want to read a comment Aaron Lee left where he just wanted to refer to what you had said about poets coming to faith through practice of looking closely and pursuing truth, beauty, and goodness. He cites an example of a Singaporean poet named Edwin Thumbu as an example. So I'm not familiar with this, but it sounds like you are. Maybe, and if those of you who aren't, you can search this. It sounds interesting. So thanks for that, Aaron. But so we'll conclude here. I wanted to give you space for kind of final closing word and takeaway that you feel like you would like the audience to take from your talk tonight.
Well, maybe what I will do is I'm just going to share one of my poems, because one of the projects I have coming up is I'm putting together an anthology of Christmas poems, which I'm hoping to have out for next Christmas. So this is one of my own, and it's called The Humiliation, and it comes from The Conspiracy of Light. It relates to something Lewis said in his essay, Is Theology Poetry? The Humiliation. Like damp mist freezing on a lamppost, this is the humiliation of myth into fact. The abstract spilled like blood on concrete, the elusive grown bold, the ritual symbolic act contracted from everywhere to the backside of nowhere, from mystery to history, from the always down to these particular days. This names a town, a time, a governor, a man and his teen bride. Each lineage is traced, shows how the greatest humiliation took place, of God into man. Here the infinite condensed to infant. The eternal was confined to one instant at a time.
Hmm. Thank you for sharing that, and I think that is a great conclusion for us to take away. This has been a great, fun conversation for me. It was great to hear from you. It was fun to talk with you after, very thought-provoking and enriching. We hope you all enjoyed it, those of you that are attending and those of you who are watching this later on YouTube. Since we're a little over time, so I'll go ahead and conclude with a very short prayer from the Book of Common Prayer, short, sweet, to the point, an evening prayer. For the sake of your Son, Jesus Christ, have mercy on us and forgive us, that we may delight in your will and walk in your ways. To the glory of your name. Amen. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Don, for talking, and we'll hope to see you all again soon.